In other news, fewer businesses in Singapore are setting their sights abroad. A survey by the Singapore Business Federation finds that less than half of those polled plan to enter in overseas markets. That's a sharp plunge from the near 60% in 2024's survey. Firms cited a lack of time and manpower, alongside uncertainty over risk and a lack in market knowledge. The survey concluded in January this year, before the war on Iran began. Overseas expansion plans are expected to decline even more sharply as businesses grapple with rising costs.
I think the momentum, of companies wanting to go overseas will continue to weaken because many companies are now focusing on the home ground, right? Again, with the energy crisis happening, many companies are watching their bottom line. And certainly travel costs have increased. But I'd like to emphasize that, it's during these times that we really hope companies can step up.
And for those that did go abroad, ASEAN was the top choice, especially Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand. Majority of those who plan to expand overseas are also looking to the region. The key draws are affordable digital infrastructure, growth potential, and manageable costs. Though unpredictable regulations, opaque businesses, practices, and cybersecurity were top concerns. Now, further away from home, China is among the most favoured, particularly because of its strong digital infrastructure and logistics network. India is another attractive option thanks to its growth potential. However, businesses are wary of changing regulations and limited access to funding. To help firms go abroad, trade associations representing them will be given a leg up in improving their organizational performance. And this includes a self-diagnostic tool and a guidebook to identify priority areas for further development. Also, encouraging collaborations among TACs and help shape future partnerships with the government.
So during this challenging period, the role of TAC is more vital than ever. Now, as a rallying force, TACs are well placed to forge deep partnerships within your members' company and also across sectors.
Because everyone trade are different, industry different, processes are different. The burning issue, we will feel it more than anyone else within the alliances itself. But when you come together at different spaces as a whole ecosystem itself, so straight away everyone have different voices from there. And then when we come together as one, we'll be able to resolve a lot of issues and problem and all together understand each other's issue and work together.
And here to share more insights is Associate Professor Puay Guan from the Department of Analytics and Operations at the NUS Business School. Prof, good to have you with us.
Thank you.
Now, we heard earlier that overseas expansion plans, that's expected to decline even more sharply after the Iran war. So how concerned should we be about this?
Well, at this point in time, this is probably a natural response. Because even if you look back at what happened last year, obviously we had uncertainties with the geopolitical uncertainties and tariff changes, for example. So probably companies were, to some extent, in a wait-and-see mode to see how it shapes out. So if they are doing alternative sourcing, for example, from Chinese manufacturers, they will need to know what are the tariff rates for the other countries. So I think there's a little bit of that wait-and-see. And of course, in the current context then of the Iran war, then what you see is probably that the companies have to deal with the immediate kind of operational issues that they have to face with first, right, in terms of higher fuel costs or maybe even certain shortages of some supply or higher prices of their raw materials. So they will have to solve this first before they can probably settle down and then start thinking about the medium and long-term strategy plans that they may have.
Yeah. Can you break this down for us, right? What is the real risk of firms not internationalizing? So can we survive with just a domestic market? Why is it so important?
So we have always said that, for Singapore companies, right, we have to go overseas because, obviously the domestic market is not big, right? And therefore, and there are also foreign players that are coming into our market. So for us, we also have to not just defend our home turf, but also to be able to go overseas. So that is probably a key factor. Of course, there are ways that the risk can be controlled as well, right? For example, through joint ventures or going to regions that we are more familiar with, or working together in consortiums, right, of companies that know each other or already have existing working relationships with each other. And therefore, when they expand overseas, they can go together and provide that same supply to the existing customers.
Yeah, so right now, which overseas markets look risky too risky for businesses right now? I mean, obviously the Middle East region is very tenuous, but why are these countries becoming more or less attractive?
Well, yeah, so as you pointed out, right, so I think at this point in time, Middle East is probably on hold because of, issues like the uncertainty from the war. Of course, previously, if you look at last year, this was one of the major areas that companies would want to look at and consider. If you look at, for example, what you mentioned in the survey earlier on, with ASEAN and China, India. So obviously, Asia is still our major playing ground in a sense, right? Because these are markets that Singapore companies are familiar with. They're also nearer, and probably culturally, we are also more familiar with them. And therefore, it makes sense, to work with these markets first. And probably at the same time, some of their existing customers may already be there. Right, and therefore that makes a market entry easier because we can get incremental business from them rather than having to start fresh and do business development to grow the business again.
Yeah. So ASEAN, China, and India, some of the countries that were mentioned, right, that seem to have the most potential at this point. Are there others that you think might be a bright spot?
Well, there are also areas where, for example, some of the Singapore companies may consider, the more developed markets. So for example, they may look at markets like Australia or US, perhaps even Europe, for the reason that some of their products are higher end products that are more expensive, and therefore it may not be so easy for them to sell into the less developed markets because of pricing. So in cases like this where they are selling products at a higher end or services at a higher end, it may also make sense for them to go overseas to the more developed markets where the companies are more willing to pay a higher premium as well.
Okay, so let's zoom out a little bit more into the wider situation. Business sentiment is already down. So how is this declining confidence then likely to ripple through the broader economy?
Well, this time is definitely will lead to more slowdown, right? So obviously, if you look, if we look back at sort of the macro picture, right, in the last year, growth was good, but now we kind of have an artificially induced type of supply shock, right, which then reduces sentiment, etc., and therefore that will reduce spending, and over time that will then percolate into the broader economy, which will then obviously reduce the economic growth.
Let's take a closer look now at the TAC Alliance 2.0. That's been launched to strengthen support for both trade associations and also chambers. But from the business perspective, what exactly will that change on the ground?
Well, I think there are a couple of ways. So one is that, of course, giving the TACs more resources and more information for information sharing would be more helpful for the members. So some of the TACs may not be so large as some others, and therefore they may not have as much access to information, or resources. But now, since there's a cross-platform for this information sharing, that means that the information can be more easily disseminated, and members of the various TACs can be made more aware. Probably in terms of cross-sector collaboration, that's also helpful, because then, when they go in as a consortium of different industries, there may also be synergies between different types of companies in terms of forming a more complete ecosystem or more complete set of suite of products and services.
Yeah, it boosts efficiency as well. Now, very quickly before we go, Prof, what more do you think can be done in this climate to reassure businesses or to give them more support to expand overseas?
I think right now, there's probably a lot of reassurance that's coming from the government, right, in terms of, providing the support and the assurance of continued support if things get worse. So probably that is important to help stabilize sort of the sentiment, because it's both the economics as well as the sentiment, right? So I think stabilizing the sentiment is important, and and then of course after that to evaluate the situation and sort of go look into what else can be done, right, so things develop.
Prof, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. I've been chatting with Prof. Puay Guan from the NUS Business School.